A leaked Pentagon email is causing a stir among NATO allies right now. It lays out possible ways the US could punish allies that refuse to support Washington's military action against Iran. Now, the big question for me here is, what does this mean for NATO and for relations between Europe and the United States at a time when unity is already under strain? Let's look at the ideas floating around. They include suspending Spain from NATO, reassessing US support for Britain's claim to the Falkland Islands, and the email also detailed the idea of the US pulling out of NATO completely. Well, for more on this, I'm joined now by two transatlantic security analysts in Washington, D.C. Jim Townsend from the Center for a New American Security knows the Pentagon very well, having served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for European and NATO policy. And Philip Dickinson is from the Atlantic Council. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us here on DW this evening. Jim, I'm going to start with you. Tell us more about this memo. Who's behind it? And is it maybe even possible that it's come from the very top level of government?
Well, that's a very good question, and I think it might be coming from the bottom of the food chain in the Pentagon. It almost sounds like bosses had gone to the staffs and said, "Hey, come up with some ideas that we can do to punish allies, UK, Spain," and so someone put together a list of various things, and whoever did this did not know NATO very well, because you don't suspend people from NATO. But I think this memo was put together and sent up the chain, if you will, up to, I guess, up to Bridge Colby, the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. It could be that Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, asked for this memo, and this is what Bridge Colby will deliver to him. And this is something to probably ultimately to curry favor with President Trump. Maybe Hegseth goes to the president and says, "Here's some great ideas. What do you think?"
And Philip, what do you think? Do you agree with this take?
Yeah, I think Jim is broadly right there. A lot of what was suggested there is nothing really. Some of the ideas themselves are somewhat new, but the tone is not new. It's very much the direction that is set from the top down, and the administration's reaction to European allies in recent weeks has been, emotionally strong. It is driven by a sense of anger, and there is a real feeling of bitterness amongst a lot of people close to the president that European allies have not had the United States back in whatever way that they necessarily expected and intended. So this is both a kind of an expression of that frustration that folks within the administration are feeling, and, as Jim suggested, kind of trying to show responsiveness to the president's own emotional reaction to the situation. But as he said, it betrays a sort of a fundamental ignorance. You can't just kick Spain out of NATO. The US's stance on the Falkland Islands has been very much mischaracterized, according to these reports. The really concerning and threat, one that we have heard before, is the threat to withdraw from NATO. That is the one that most European allies will be most concerned about.
So, Jim, I want to come back to you then. What does NATO law have to say about this kind of move? Philip, you just said it wasn't actually possible to kick out a NATO member. Is there a scenario in which that kind of thing would ever be possible?
Well, it's been discussed off and on for years as a bad actor pops up on the scene, and the allies begin to murmur among themselves, wish we could fire people from NATO. But there is no provision for that within the North Atlantic Treaty or anything else that governs how NATO operates. There's no suspension, there's no firing, there's no kind of sanctions. This is the only thing you can do is if a nation itself wants to leave, it can give 60 days notice and it can leave. Of course, for the United States, that would be a heavy lift, because you just don't, it's not a light switch. You just flip and then you're out. It's going to be a lot of heavy lifting, literally, to move the U.S. out. So there is no provision for punishing some ally by suspending them or by kicking them out. It's within the alliance. It's the Secretary General who works with the allies to bring them back in line if there's something going on that really has the alliance upset. That's how you deal with these things. You don't fire people.
And let's look a little bit at the response from Europe. Philip, the Spanish Prime Minister was asked about this leaked memo. Let's listen in first to what he had to say, and then I want to get your take on that.
Well, we don't base our work on emails. We base it on official documents and the stance taken in this case by the US government. The Spanish government's position is clear: full cooperation with our allies, but always within the framework of international law.
Philip, you worked at the British Embassy in Washington and you've got a good understanding of the diplomatic discussions that go on in situations like these. How seriously should allies be taking a document like this? I mean, does Spain need to be worried?
Well, the Spanish Prime Minister has been one of the most kind of forthright in criticising the administration's policies on Iran. I'm not surprised that he's not backing down at all. His own domestic popularity in polling has increased quite significantly over recent weeks, driven by to a large degree by his stance on this issue. Spain should think carefully, I suppose, about exactly how much it wants to antagonize the Trump administration based on its long-term national security interests. Spain very much sees itself as an important player within NATO, but perhaps with a NATO remit that is sometimes overlooked. Spain cares a lot about stability and security in the Mediterranean, in North Africa, the source of the crises that drive a lot of migration into Europe. That is something that is a major issue for Spain. But the Prime Minister there is right to say that he shouldn't be commenting on leaked emails, etc. That's kind of not a diplomatically sensible thing to do. They shouldn't be overreacting, but they should be thinking long and hard about what is in the core national interests of Spain in terms of how it responds to this and how it builds a sustainable and durable, healthy relationship with the United States, assuming that that is still in Spain's national interest, which I think it very much is.
And Jim, what tools does the US actually have when it comes to pressuring its allies here?
Well, I think we've seen some of those on display over the past year with Trump, particularly. I think a tool is a rhetorical one, and I think that's what Trump has been using by saying these things, by putting pressure on allies, by criticizing them, by threatening them. That has put a lot of pressure on the alliance. And it might produce a result, such as the allies agreeing to spend 5% of their GDP on defense, but it comes at a cost. That kind of tool is a double-edged sword, and that seems to be one of the tools that Trump turns to. That, as well as the threat to pull out of NATO. So those are extreme tools. There's other ways in which you can work with allies, not pressure them in terms of being a bully, but you work with allies behind the scenes. You work with allies together at NATO around the North Atlantic Council table, where all the NATO allies meet and work on issues. The U.S. has led the allies through a lot of tough issues and a lot of discussions that have been heated. Where the U.S. comes in with one view, other allies have other views, and we are able to talk it out and come up with ways to compromise and to move things forward, because it's in the interest of all the allies that NATO work. And NATO can only work when the allies can come together and compromise on things, not use tools like threats and bullying. So yes, there are tools, and there are tools that can really get things done, and there are tools that make things worse.
Very good point there, Jim. I mean, let's talk about the reaction within the US now. Philip, what are people saying in the US political and media worlds as a result of the leak of this memo?
I think it's really important to emphasize just how strong and consistent US public support in general, writ large, is for NATO and for supporting NATO allies, even amongst MAGA Republicans. There is about 70% of Americans in general would support an Article 5 situation and coming to the aid of allies. Most members of Congress are strongly supportive of NATO, in spite of the various kind of back and forth and the turbulence around the specific issues. And NATO and Congress wrote itself into legislative law that it needs to be part of the process for ratifying any US withdrawal from NATO. Congress passed an act in 2023 that was co-authored by Marco Rubio to say that Congress needs to have the final say on that decision. But there are ways, of course, in which the US can sort of act unilaterally without Congress's approval to introduce a lot of chaos into the NATO and the transatlantic relationship. But that would not be popular amongst the broader American public. There is a general sense of frustration that Europe for a long time has been, quote unquote, sort of freeloading on the American security umbrella. But nobody here really wants to completely rip up the transatlantic relationship. Americans in general feel pretty warmly and positively towards Europe, and I think in general understand the benefits that the NATO alliance has had over many decades. Yes, it comes with some costs, but Europe is America's biggest trading partner and sort of key to American power projection around the world. And I think a lot of Americans would be very concerned about acting hastily to undo 8 decades of good, solid work.
So off the back of that then, Jim, do you think that this strengthens US leverage or risks isolating Washington at a point where unity is really critical for NATO allies? How much does the US even need NATO?
Well, the U.S. needs NATO quite a bit, and again, it's hard for people to understand that, particularly if they frame it the way the president frames it, in terms of, look, we've got a mighty military, we can go off and do what we want to do. We don't need NATO. It's NATO that needs us. There's freeloading, et cetera, et cetera. But in fact, and again, I think Philip just very eloquently laid a lot of this out, saying that in terms of force projection, in terms of using bases in Europe, in terms of having friends when you find yourself in trouble somewhere. And I think this is the point that the president seems to not understand in terms of NATO and the Gulf and what's happening with Iran. He's attacking NATO for not coming to his aid. It's not NATO as an institution. It's the NATO allies who decided that unlike in the past when they have come to the aid of the United States, whether it's in Iraq or in other things that we've had to do, the Desert Storm, they wanted to not get involved with Iran. So it's individual decisions, sovereign decisions made by nations not to get involved, which is their right. It's not a NATO thing. And so in the past, though, these allies have been with us in so many of the wars that came out of 9/11. So the idea that that we don't need allies or that we don't need NATO, we can do things ourselves, that has been disproven over the past 50 years in terms of allies, whether as nations or as part of NATO, have come to help the United States in various situations, whether it's Afghanistan or Iraq, and they made a different decision when it came to fighting a war with Iran.
Well, let's look at another.
I just jump in?
Oh, yeah, of course. Please do.
Sorry, just to come in off the back of what Jim said, I completely agree. But I would emphasize that, your question was about, does this give the United States leverage? Like in the short term, sure. If you want to act really aggressively, you can maybe twist an arm to get a better deal on a sort of a small tactical issue in the short term. But in the long term, it's really bad strategy. Already, we are seeing allies in Europe and Canada. Mark Carney gave that speech at Davos, where they're starting to think about a post-American order and, to what extent they need to hedge against a lack of reliability on American support in the future and a world order that is underpinned by American leadership. You're already seeing kind of thought, political groupings and thought leadership, etc., that is starting to take shape that is not necessarily in the United States' best long-term interest. And this is where I think there is a disconnect between short-term tactical gain and long-term strategic disadvantage that is being written in.
Well, thanks for jumping in there, Philip. I think that was great analysis to hear. Off the back of that, do you think that this could potentially actually just be a diversion tactic from the Trump administration? I mean, it's another story to distract from the fact that the Iran war may not exactly be going as planned. What do you think about that?
No, I don't think it's just a diversion tactic. I think it is coming from a genuine place and a feeling of genuine anger and frustration at European allies. Misplaced, I would say, but I think it's more than just trying to move the news media along. The president has many ways in which he can do this. He has his Truth Social account. He's not afraid to use it. So I think, this is a leaked Pentagon email is what has caused the latest kerfuffle. So I don't think that would necessarily be the way that this administration would choose to kind of set a news agenda.
And now I've got a question to put to both of you to round up this interview. Jim, we'll get your take first. Where do you actually see the future of NATO after this? You've both mentioned about the biggest flag from this being that the US has threatened to pull out of NATO. What's your take there?
Well, I don't think the U.S. is going to pull out of NATO. I think what the U.S. is going to do is along the lines Philip was just talking about in terms of NATO is going to have to adapt to an alliance that has more of Europe in it than the U.S. in terms of leadership, in terms of military capability, in terms of engagement. I think no matter who wins the next election, I think by the time we get to that year of having a new president, a new administration, I think the U.S. will have distanced itself a bit from NATO and from European defense. We're already starting to do that. And as Philip said, in Europe, there's already quite a move that's afoot now. It's not just talk, it's happening, where the Europeans have realized there's too much dependency on the United States anyway. That should never have been allowed to reach the state that it did, and it was agreed on both sides. I saw it happen, and so there's an agreement now that they're going to say to Trump, sure, we will do this. We will carry more of the burden. We will become stronger, and we will take care of European defense, and therefore we want more of a say at NATO, and we want to be engaged more on what happens at NATO. We want the U.S. to remain part of NATO. I don't think Europe wants us out. But I think they are saying we are going to play much more of a role in terms of European defense, European decision-making. The EU is going to probably play a bit more of a role in its own way, whether it's through finances, etc. But there's going to be more of Europe in NATO and less of the United States there.
And Philip, same question to you. Where do you see the future of NATO after all this?
Yeah, I agree with Jim there. The key question about this is how quickly and is how orderly the process of that transition can be. If this can be something drawn out over the span of 10 years, where Europeans can sort of take a measured and orderly approach to stepping in to fill American capabilities that might be redeployed elsewhere, etc., then I think Europeans can see some long-term real strategic advantage in this, in eliminating an area of vulnerability in their own kind of strategic position in the world and their ability to act and maneuver autonomously in the world. But if it's done quickly, in a rush, without great coordination, and done as a sort of impulsive move to punish Europeans, that's the really big concern, because that's when something chaotic can happen, and that's when adversaries and bad actors see opportunity in that sort of disunity and disharmony. It's Mark Rutte's primary and essentially his only job, really, is to make sure that that transition is executed in a sensible and smooth and predictable way.
Jim Townsend and Philip Dickinson. That were really great insights from both of you there. Thank you so much for joining us here on DW.
Pleasure.
Well, we want to get your take as well. So let us know what you think. Should NATO be concerned about these threats? Where do you see the future of the alliance? Give us your take in the comments. If you like this video, please hit that like button. And if you haven't already, then don't forget to subscribe. Thank you so much for watching.